The cigarette trembled. That was all. A single, involuntary shudder of a cigarette held between two fingers, and in that fraction of a second, the United States government knew it had found its man. No satellite, no intercept, no algorithm, just a former soldier sitting across a table from a quiet FBI agent named Joe Navarro and a nervous system that simply could not lie fast enough. This is the story of how the world's most expensive, most sophisticated, most technologically advanced security apparatus has time and again been outmaneuvered, outwitted, and betrayed. Not by supervillains, not by rogue states with doomsday weapons, but by ordinary people, soldiers in cramped apartments, custodians with high IQs, a sergeant who thought espionage was just good business. Welcome to the world of intelligence, a world where nothing is what it seems, where every secret costs something, and where the line between protector and predator is drawn not in law, but in loyalty. To understand betrayal, you first have to understand the machine that was betrayed. The modern intelligence apparatus wasn't built overnight. It grew slowly, reactively, each new bureau, each new law, each new alliance forged in the aftermath of disaster. The United States Bureau of Investigation was born in 1908, not from ambition but from fear. Britain passed its Official Secrets Act in 1911, not from foresight but from paranoia. And then came 1917, and a decoded telegram that changed everything. The Zimmermann telegram. A German foreign secretary, in the arrogance of wartime calculation, sent a secret message to Mexico proposing an alliance, and promising Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona as the reward. British codebreakers intercepted it. The United States entered World War I. A single decoded message reshaped the map of the 20th century. Signals intelligence had announced itself. The age of shadows had truly begun. For the next 3 decades, the machine grew in the darkness. Through the catastrophic intelligence failure of Pearl Harbor, through the feverish recruitment wars of the Cold War, through the birth of the CIA in 1947, and the classified handshake of the UK-USA agreement that would eventually become the Five Eyes Alliance. 5 nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, bound together in a web of shared secrets so vast and so deep that even today, its full architecture remains classified. By the time the Cold War frosted into its long, paranoid winter, the world of intelligence had become a civilizational organ, as vital and as hidden as a beating heart. Satellite programs like Corona were photographing Soviet missile sites from orbit. Deep cover, illegals were living fake lives in foreign cities, sometimes for decades. The game was total. The stakes were planetary. And then, in 1985, the machine nearly destroyed itself from within. They would later call it the Year of the Spy. 1985. Ronald Reagan was in the White House. The Soviet Union was beginning its long, invisible collapse, and somewhere inside the most secure intelligence infrastructure in human history, the walls were bleeding. Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer with a drinking problem, a failing marriage, and a taste for money he couldn't afford, walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and offered to sell everything he knew. Over the following years, he would betray more than 100 intelligence operations and send at least 10 CIA assets to their deaths. The KGB called him KOLOKOL, the bell, and for nearly a decade he rang, and no one heard it. In the same year, a KGB officer named Vitaly Yushchenko defected to the Americans. And then, in one of the most theatrical moments of Cold War espionage, redefected back to the Soviets, holding a press conference to claim he had been kidnapped. Whether he was a genuine defector who got cold feet or a deliberate provocation sent to sow confusion remains debated to this day. The Year of the Spy exposed something terrifying. The machine had a metabolism. It could consume its own operators. And when it did, the damage didn't announce itself with alarms and flashing lights. It arrived in silence, in the form of operations that quietly failed, assets who quietly disappeared, and cables that returned no reply. But even the Year of the Spy, with all its devastation, paled before what was already unfolding in a small West German city called Bad Kreuznach. His name was Clyde Lee Conrad, and he didn't think of himself as a traitor. He thought of himself as an entrepreneur. Conrad was a sergeant in the United States Army's 8th Infantry Division, stationed in Bad Kreuznach in the late 1970s. By most accounts, he was unremarkable, competent, sociable, not obviously malicious. But he had access. Enormous, catastrophic, world-altering access. As a document custodian, he moved through vaults of NATO's most sensitive operational planning as casually as a librarian moves through stacks. He had been recruited by a man named Zoltan Szabo, a lieutenant of Hungarian descent who had himself been co-opted by the Hungarian III Directorate in 1971. The chain of betrayal was elegant in its simplicity. One man who had been turned, turning another, who turned another still. A pyramid of compromise, built on ambition, debt, and the oldest human weakness, the belief that one's own actions will never truly catch up with them. Conrad earned upwards of $2 million. He recruited a custodian named Rod Ramsey. He brought in couriers, the Kirksick brothers, operating out of Sweden, to physically move material across borders. He built, in every practical sense, a private espionage corporation. His handlers reportedly called it the Enterprise. It was, by any measure, the most professionally run spy ring in Cold War history. But the tradecraft, that is where the story becomes genuinely cinematic. Forget the Minox cameras and dead drops of classic spy novels. Conrad's ring operated with DIY ingenuity that made Western counterintelligence analysts blink in disbelief. They filmed NATO documents onto videotapes, not photographs, tapes, recorded over Disney movies. They used American NTSC format cassettes in a European PAL format country, so that any German authority who seized a tape simply couldn't play it. They rented an apartment on Joseph Schneider Strasse, a fully lit civilian workspace, to process documents. When Western analysts first received reports of soldiers renting a lit apartment for secretive work, they dismissed it as absurd. No serious spy ring would operate so brazenly. The dismissal cost them years. And Conrad's custom-designed briefcase, a masterpiece of Cold War improvisation, contained a hidden lever. If a courier sensed he was about to be stopped, a single pull would drag the tape between two powerful magnets, erasing hours of classified footage in seconds. The damage, when it was finally assessed, was almost incomprehensible. General Edwin Otis testified that if hostilities had begun, Conrad's intelligence would have guaranteed the destruction of Western forces within 72 hours. The ring had compromised permissive action links, the nuclear authentication codes that prevent unauthorized weapons launches. It had provided the Soviets with the ability to insert false codes into Western systems, potentially triggering a nuclear stand-down at the precise moment it was needed most. The fate of Europe, in a very real sense, had rested on a stack of Disney videotapes. Conrad was eventually arrested in 1988 in Sweden, but the investigation's most decisive moment came not in a confrontation, not in a raid, but in a quiet room, across a table, with a man and his cigarette. Rod Ramsey had been living an ordinary life. He was intelligent, genuinely, disturbingly intelligent, and he had covered his tracks with the kind of careful, methodical precision that frustrated every technical approach investigators tried. Wiretaps produced nothing definitive. Paper trails looped back on themselves. So FBI Special Agent Joe Navarro sat down with him, and he watched. Navarro was not a technologist. He was a student of the human animal, trained in behavioral analysis, in the science of what the body reveals when the mind is trying to conceal. He knew that stress doesn't always announce itself in words. Sometimes it appears in a hand, in a blink, in the involuntary neurological tremor of a cigarette held by a man who just heard a name he was trying to forget. When Navarro mentioned Conrad, Ramsey's cigarette shook like a seismograph needle during an earthquake. That was the tell, not a confession, not a document, a tremor. And from that single involuntary moment, Navarro built a case that took 42 interviews and ultimately produced a full accounting of the ring's operations. In the calculus of modern intelligence, with its satellites and intercepts and quantum-encrypted data streams, it was a human nervous system that closed the case. Catastrophic failures, when they are finally digested, produce institutional change. In Hungary, the Conrad ring's exposure became a generational wound. Hungarian officials later described it as the most severe and painful legacy of the Kadar regime. A reminder that the III Directorate, the Communist-era intelligence apparatus, had not merely failed to protect Hungary, but had actively weaponized its own military against the Western alliance it now sought to join. In the years after the Soviet collapse, Hungary maintained separate military intelligence agencies, one for counterintelligence, one for external foreign intelligence, a Cold War structure that no longer matched a post-Cold War world. In 2011 and 2012, they were merged into the Military National Security Service, a single integrated body intended to eliminate duplication, accelerate information flow, and align Hungary with NATO standards. The merger was well-intentioned. Parts of it worked, but institutional reform, like espionage itself, has a way of producing unintended consequences. In the staff reductions that followed, a generation of analysts was cut, experts fluent in Russian and Ukrainian, trained in Soviet-era methodologies, who carried in their minds a map of regional culture that no database could replicate. They were expensive. They were old. They were, in the language of administrative efficiency, redundant. And then, as the years passed and tensions in Eastern Europe began to escalate, their absence opened a hole in Hungarian intelligence that no organizational chart had anticipated and no merger could fill. The lesson written in the margins of every institutional reform study, ignored generation after generation. Human expertise is not a line item. It is infrastructure. And when you demolish infrastructure to save money, you pay for it later in a currency far more expensive than budget. In 2013, a quiet NSA contractor named Edward Snowden walked out of his office with a hard drive and rewrote the public's understanding of the surveillance state. In 2014, for the first time in history, the United States government indicted 5 active Chinese military officers for cyber espionage. Not a diplomatic protest, not a back-channel rebuke, but a formal criminal indictment, stripping away the polite fiction that nation-states don't spy on each other. The game had gone public. The shadows had been dragged into the light, blinking and unrepentant. And still, somewhere tonight, in a city whose name you will never know, in a building with no sign on the door, someone is watching. Someone is listening. Someone is building a file on a threat that hasn't announced itself yet. Someone is reading the tremor in a voice, the hesitation in a sentence, the pause before an answer that should have come instantly. The technology changes. The satellites multiply. The algorithms grow more sophisticated with every passing year. But the fundamental nature of the game, the recruitment, the betrayal, the cover, the exposure, the damage that cannot be undone, that hasn't changed since the first king sent the first spy into the first enemy city. Because intelligence, at its irreducible core, is not a technology problem. It is a human problem. And human beings, in all their brilliance and all their weakness, remain both the greatest vulnerability in the system and its only reliable safeguard. The cigarette trembles, and the world for one more day holds.